the presentation to our presenter. Hope you all enjoy.
Hi everyone, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to pull up my presentation here really quickly. The person you're seeing on the screen, that's my son, Plankton. I just figured I'd give him a shout out because why not? Probably because we're going to be talking about some pretty dark things today, so why not have some lovely cat faces in our visual when we go about this webinar. So let me pull this up. All right, so a little bit about me. I'm a PhD candidate at Washington State University. I'm getting my PhD in criminal justice and criminology. I'm originally from upstate New York, which is going to be beneficial today because I can talk really fast and get through a lot of material for us. My areas of specialization include violence towards women, rape culture, pornography, and I've also done some work in institutional corrections. I want to give a big thank you to the Colorado Coalition for hosting today, and an even bigger thank you for those in attendance. A couple of things. I'm often referred to as what's called a porn content expert, which is much less insidious and potentially a little bit more exciting than it sounds. I've talked to a lot of different groups about pornography and rape culture and sexual violence. I've recently spoken at Syracuse University. I've done a few webinars for the Illinois CASA, I have one coming up here in Wisconsin, New York State, sort of run the gamut in terms of professionals. I've spoken here on campus with Greek students, with non-Greek students, criminal justice majors, women's studies students, and I've actually just recently completed a presentation at the Washington State Department of Corrections with a group of male inmates where we talked about violence prevention and rape culture. And that was a really fruitful conversation linking masculinity to violence, and I feel like I got a lot out of that. So without further ado, let's move forward. I've published quite extensively on rape culture and sexual violence. I wanted to give you a heads up that I can give these these publications to you at the end if you shoot me an email, and I'll give you all my contact information as well. But suffice it to say, this is really a rich vein of study, and I'm excited to share some of these results with you today and really have a robust conversation. So, since we already know where people are hailing from, let's talk a little bit about the learning objectives for today. So really my ultimate goal is twofold. I want to ensure I highlight how violence towards women is not an anomaly within the pornography industry, nor in the culture with which we reside. I want to ensure that you all are equipped to go back and talk about this topic with your students, with community members, with fellow advocates, and with constituents. So at the end, I'll sort of give you a synopsis of what I've learned in terms of having these conversations with a variety of individuals. I think that it's important to have these conversations and to continue them because discussing sexual violence without also discussing pornography, it's like having a conversation about the obesity epidemic. You know, it's not the only variable contributing to it. Fast food is not the only variable contributing to it, but it's likely situated squarely on that list. So we need to have these conversations, if not only because it's a major contributing factor to a lot of the sexual violence and the normalization of sexual violence that we're seeing in our culture. So a couple of disclaimers. I do these disclaimers with just about every group I talk to just to give everybody a sense of what we're going to be chatting about. I feel like in my experience, a lot of people never have formal conversations about pornography, so it's important to sort of set the stage for the conversation. This conversation is going to be graphic. I'm going to be telling you a bit about the norms within the porn industry as it stands, and some of those norms can be jarring to people, so keep that in mind. I'm not shaming anyone for any of their sexual interests while I'm doing this webinar. When I conduct this research, I'm really trying to keep it sex positive here as much as I can, while also sort of having a conversation about the norms within the industry. I have sort of a unique perspective on pornography. I'm not an anti-porn feminist that believes the industry should be abolished. I think that's unrealistic. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that a lot of people have a vested interest in maintaining. But rather, I think on an individual level, sometimes pornography can be empowering and sexually gratifying, again, on an individual level. I'm also not anti-pornography because I find it shameful or sinful or anything like that. I'm certainly not claiming to be morally superior to anyone else, and that's not the perspective that I come from. What's interesting to me is there's been some recent statements from conservatives in the media about pornography being what's known as a quote-unquote public health crisis. And I don't necessarily agree with the angle or rationale behind that message, but I'm thankful that in the very least it's starting a much-needed dialogue about the harms that are inherent to pornography, especially in the way with which we see it today. Yes, I realize that both men and women consume pornography, so let's just put that out there right now. I will be talking about mainstream porn marketed to heterosexual men today, specifically heterosexual men who generally watch by themselves, which is the bulk of the industry. I'm not talking about feminist pornography, although I will sort of briefly touch on that. There's a lot of genres. I'm really coming from a perspective of what's being mass marketed and available widely online. I think that I'm coming from, when I have these conversations, a more of a realistic place. I really think that we can be critical consumers of this content because it's not going away, and we have to have these conversations, especially with young people, because this is permeating our daily lives, and it's really feeding into a culture that normalizes sexual violence. So that's sort of the end of my disclaimers. Again, like I said, I'll take questions at the end of the presentation, but note, you can put those right in the chat box, and I'll be able to answer those when we get through this content. So without further ado, let's sort of couch this discussion in a broader conversation about rape culture. So most of you probably know what rape culture is, right? Cultural norms and mores that sort of normalize sexual violence, minimize sexual violence, satirize it, and condone it. And I think that we need to really talk about rape culture because pornography is sort of subsisting within this sort of nebulous space. These two things are intimately linked. Rape culture is sort of the infrastructure that enables violence to occur and validates it when it happens. It also misrepresents sex and gender-based violence as normal and expected, just like what we would see in pornography. So a couple of examples of rape culture for those who maybe aren't that versed in it as of yet. Rape culture can be viewing sex as violent and violence as sexy. So the language that we use to discuss sex, for instance, would be an example of rape culture. So we hear young people especially using terms like bang, hit, smash, tear it up, murder it, all these sorts of colloquialisms to discuss the act of sexual intercourse, and they all have violent connotations. And oftentimes when I bring that up with students, they're a bit surprised because they just use that term or those terms so much they don't even recognize the violence therein. A couple of other examples of rape culture that I most recently saw in the news, I don't know if you all saw this, out of Philadelphia, there was a 14-year-old girl. She was sex trafficked and forced into, or actually she was a rape victim. 1,000 men were forcing themselves upon her within this hotel in Philadelphia. And this recently came to light after she was able to sort of get out of that situation and escape. What was particularly interesting to me about this article that I was reading was nowhere in the article or the story do they refer to her as a rape victim or the men who raped her as child rapists? She was essentially construed as someone who was getting paid or more in a prostitution sort of light rather than the rape victim that she was, and that was unfortunate to me. Another thing that I recently saw in the news, this actually came out yesterday, I believe, was a Brazilian soccer player. He was convicted of torturing and murdering his ex-girlfriend, and then he fed her body to some local dogs. Then he went to prison for a while, and now he's allowed to play soccer again within a team in Brazil after his release from prison. So that is a very good example of rape culture where gendered violence is not only normalized, but it's excused, especially when the individual in question is a major star. Another thing that I really want to talk about with rape culture is the normalization around young people and violence. There was some recent research from 2015 where this researcher interviewed girls ages 3 to 17. And they were asking them about men's violence perpetrated against them. And the bulk of the young girls interviewed found men's violence to be natural and unproblematic. They even dangerously constructed this violence as romantic or flirtatious. And they also were found to criticize other women for not mitigating that violence or handling that violence what they deemed to be appropriately. So this is some really terrible, albeit fascinating research that's come out around these cultural norms around violence. And they really show us that, rape culture is alive and well, and I think that pornography plays a big role within it. So why are we discussing pornography in terms of rape culture? Well, many researchers have called porn rape culture propaganda. Porn is not simply a harmless fantasy, as many people would lead you to believe. It's sustainable. It has a sustainable and quantifiable impact on behavior. I mean, the media as a whole has a huge impact on behavior. If it didn't, then the entire advertising industry would collapse because it's predicated on the idea that imagery and videography can alter our behavior and consumption patterns. So porn viewers internalize the messages that they're seeing. I liken it to this recent epidemic, one might say, of fake news in many ways, because it's obviously an inaccurate representation of fact, but millions of people believe it, and they change their behavior in respect to it nonetheless. So many people, when I'm having this conversation, they expect me to lay out some sort of linear relationship between porn and violence. Like X porn video resulted in Y act of sexual violence. It's not that simple. Pornography and rape culture create a way of thinking about sexual violence that minimizes it and normalizes it. Rape culture and the pornography therein metaphorically drives perpetrators to and away from the scene of the crime. In a rape culture, pornography is violent visual pageantry. It's a performative spectacle. It's embellished with over-dramatizations and blatant falsehoods, including that violence is always erotic, and that anything erotic is to be degrading, abusive, and violent. And remember, men and women have already been groomed to view gender violence as normal within a rape culture, well before ever consuming porn. So when pornography is introduced, it reaffirms and bolsters what is already known about gender-based violence. So let's talk about the pornography industry, or where we see it today. So back in the day, many moons ago, the porn industry was sort of relegated to video stores and magazines and adult theaters, and it was sort of a seedy sort of industry. It wasn't so normalized. It's always been around, but it really wasn't a fertile, profitable industry until we started to see the Playboys of the world come out, Hustlers, Penthouses, and then VHS and so on. What I see in mainstream culture, and what many of you probably see, is that popular culture sort of is reflective of pornography now. So we see all of this sort of seedy, pornographic imagery that was once relegated to, sort of these seedy theaters or sort of the underground sex industry. We're seeing this on commercials now. We see these images in movies, in magazines. Heck, we even see this sort of pornographic imagery in Halloween costumes and children and teen clothing options. All of these are like awash with hypersexualized imagery. Again, not unlike the imagery that was once relegated solely to the early pornography industry. I should note here, again, I'm not sort of shaming any of the individuals who, or specifically the women who appear in these advertisements, in television commercials, in music videos. You know, on an individual level, sort of performing one's sexuality and, you know, owning it and feeling sexy, you know, on an individual level, that's very empowering. You know, owning and expressing one's sexuality on their own terms, it's inherently positive, right? However, you know, I worry on a cultural level when we're seeing these sort of pornographic images in popular culture that the cultural level, or excuse me, on the cultural level, these messages are ultimately disempowering. You know, as women are constructed as sort of hypersexualized playthings existing for men's pleasure and not their own. So we have to ask ourselves, you know, when we're looking through this lens of this pornified popular culture, you know, can women truly experience sexual agency and empowerment when they're seriously appropriating patriarchal and misogynistic sexual performances that we see in mainstream porn? And what is empowering on an individual level isn't necessarily empowering for all. So if the mainstream, or excuse me, if mainstream popular culture has been pornified, what does the pornography industry look like? You know, what is the next step for this industry if mainstream popular culture has sort of appropriated a lot of those images? Well, I can tell you that it's getting more and more extreme. But before we get into sort of the extreme visualizations that we see in the mainstream industry, let's go through some definitions really quickly and sort of deconstruct what I'm actually talking about. So today I'm not talking about erotica, and if you don't know the definition of erotica, it's essentially depictions of sexuality that are mutual, consent is clearly present, there's intimacy. You know, I'm not talking about that. There certainly is a genre for that online, but I'm talking about mainstream internet pornography mass marketed to generally heterosexual men. There once was a distinction between softcore and hardcore pornography. A good example of softcore pornography is popular culture, right? We're seeing these images all over the place. There's no longer that distinction. Maybe a good example from, let's say, the 80s and 90s of softcore pornography might be those sort of late night movies you would see on Cinemax, or otherwise known as Skinemax, that were available widely before sort of the advent of the internet and the proliferation of internet pornography. So what I'm talking about today is hardcore pornography. You know, there's really no distinction at this point. Most, if not all, of the pornography available on the web is hardcore. We can sort of delineate that into a couple categories. Gonzo versus features. Gonzo porn is sort of the pornography that you would see on these mainstream porn websites. So it's just basically videos depicting sex, wall-to-wall sex, and not sort of a background or a plot or anything like that. Features, on the other hand, is what we would typically think of in the 90s, let's say, of these like almost mainstream films that would be adapted into porn versions, or they would have, essentially it would be a porn movie that would have a plot, probably some really bad acting, but acting nonetheless, and it wouldn't be all sex all the time. There would be certainly sex scenes within these videos, but it wouldn't be the bulk of the content necessarily. So what we're seeing a lot is gonzo online. Sometimes not. We see performers breaking what's called the third wall, and we're seeing them interact with producers and cameramen and all of that. But on the mainstream porn websites that I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's sort of the content that we're seeing is just blatant sex in any way that someone might want to search that on these sites. Again, I'm talking about, in my research, mainstream heterosexual pornography that's created and marketed to generally straight men watching alone. Like I said, there's been an escalation in content in terms of the acts that are represented therein, because if popular culture is showing pornographic images that are already highly sexualized, the porn industry has to keep up. So keep that in mind as we move forward, that they're competing with a culture that's already saturated in pornographic images. So when I'm talking about internet pornography, I'm talking about content that is easily accessible with the click of a mouse. Generally, you can access it anonymously via your phone, your laptop, iPad, whatever, and it's affordable, if not free. So these are some of the most popular free porn websites that we would find online. The bulk of my research comes from xvideos.com, and most of these sites, again, you can search for just about any type of content that you would like en masse, and it is just going to pull up a bunch of videos based off of your searches. These are all free, legal, tube and hub sites. Users generally upload the content or scenes, and again, it's endlessly searchable, and anyone can search these images. Some of these sites have social media components, which I find particularly interesting. So you could go on, let's say, Pornhub.com or xvideos.com, and we can see how many likes a video got, let's say, or upvotes. We can see the tags that users have associated with the video. And sometimes we can see commentary on a video. Much like you would see, let's say, on a YouTube video where there are comments underneath, there are also these sorts of comments on pornography when we see these on these free sites. So keep in mind, this is not all of the porn available online, but these are some of the most popular sites that we're seeing for free, unadulterated pornography. Pornhub in particular is particularly interesting. They do actually, from a PhD perspective, a lot of great work with the data from users that they see coming to their site. So Pornhub actually has what's called insights, and they do a lot of statistical measurements each year to sort of determine who's watching and from where. So I pulled this data from pornhub.com/insights, where they talked about sort of their year in review for 2016. So this is one site, mind you, out of a plethora that are available online. So on Pornhub alone in 2016, 92 billion videos were watched. And they had about 64 million unique visitors per day. That's about 4.6 billion hours of pornography consumed in 2016 on one website. So extrapolate those numbers across the millions of porn websites that are available across the globe. Humans are watching a lot of porn. Again, what's particularly interesting about these insights from Pornhub.com is they break this down into favorite times that people are watching pornography, when and where people are logging in from, not only in the United States but abroad. They delineate top search terms in the United States, which the top 6 search terms on Pornhub.com are as follows: lesbian porn, stepmom porn, MILF, teen, stepsister, and mom. So 3 of the top 6 search terms are blatantly incestual in nature, just so that's not lost on anyone. And these are the terms for the United States. Their data from across the globe also highlight that overwhelmingly men are accessing these sites, and women to certainly a lesser extent. But if you are interested in seeing any of this data, I highly recommend going to pornhub.com/insights. It gives you a lot of information on who is visiting their site, and it's just sort of a data mining, just a haven. And they have a lot of great charts and all of that to sort of show you who's watching and when. So again, this is one website, 92 billion videos watching. This is why we need to have these conversations, because a lot of people are consuming this content. Another thing that recently came out with Pornhub.com, which I found particularly interesting, they just started their own sexual wellness center. So essentially, if you go to Pornhub.com/sex, you're going to find what essentially amounts to sex education for their users. So here I pulled this right off the site. It says our site is divided into a few different categories. Under the Get Healthy tab, you can get some information about sexual anatomy, about STDs, STIs, reproductive health. They're also talking about sexuality and relationships, and they have a lot of PhDs on there who are contributing. What do I think about this development? I think it's a great example of commodified altruism on the part of Pornhub. I mean, don't get me wrong, I can see the merit in having this website that is dedicated to sort of delivering sex ed for the millions of visitors for Pornhub on a daily basis. And I do think that people will undoubtedly find this information useful, particularly given the abysmal status of comprehensive sex ed in the U.S. However, unless Pornhub meaningfully confronts the rampant misogyny and violence towards women on their site and their sister sites, I can't fully hop on board with this messaging. In fact, the day I found out, which was last month, that Pornhub had developed a sexual wellness center online, I thought to myself, okay, that's fine. Well, let's go to the main page of Pornhub.com. Let's see which videos are being marketed to their users, just out of curiosity. So the day I found this out, went to the main page. One of the first videos I saw, and on the main page of Pornhub, it's generally categorized by who's watching now or what the most popular videos are or the newest or what have you. There was a video entitled Extreme Painful First Anal, Brutal, Crying, Gangbang, and Rough. You know, admittedly kind of a crappy user-generated title, but either way, this was inherently violent. And the screenshot for that video showed a woman crying. Either way, you know, Pornhub will market their new sexual education site, but in the same breath, they'll host videos where women are highlighted as being in pain and crying during rough anal sex. Accordingly, I call BS on some of the sexual wellness center stuff. You know, it's great that, you know, they're trying to offer sex ed to their consumers because they clearly have a lot of consumers, but I really think this is, it could be done in a better way if they were confronting some of the misogynistic tropes that are on their site. So they are having some good conversations on there in terms of healthy sexuality, but they're lacking in terms of dealing with the misogyny that's rampant on their site. So again, check that out, pornhub.com/sex, very important sort of new development in terms of porn websites and what they're offering to their consumers. So let's talk about, more broadly, what sorts of behaviors are in mainstream porn. The behaviors that I'm going to talk about right now, these are not me pulling from the most heinous, abusive, violent websites. These are behaviors that one would see in the most popular videos on mainstream free pornographic hubs. So what we see here is degrading imagery. We see abusive behaviors. We see painful sex. We see women being targeted with hateful language, whether they're being called names. And I didn't even put all of the names on here just to save you some sort of mental trauma from hearing all of the horrible things that women are called in some of these videos. But suffice it to say, it's quite graphic. We're seeing a lot of physical violence towards women in a lot of these videos, so slapping, strangulation, gagging, again, degrading imagery. I thought to myself as I was preparing this, by the way, I almost never mention sort of the kneeling in submission that we typically see in pornographic videos. And what I'm referring to is where women at the end of the scene or during a scene may be kneeling in submission to generally a male actor. Whether this is to signify the end of a scene via a money shot, which is where a man would ejaculate on a woman's face or body. But I almost never mention that because it's so commonplace in pornography now that it's sort of, it's representative of a submissive dominant sort of dyad, but it's so common that I don't even necessarily think about it. Another couple of things that I want to mention here, anal sex actually wasn't a mainstream feature in pornography until the late 90s, early 2000s. That used to be relegated to sort of niche genres, and now that's another thing that's so common within a lot of these videos that, you know, it bears talking about, but it's really taken more of an extreme turn. So as I mentioned here, these extreme acts of violence perpetrated on women could look like what's known as quote-unquote throat fucking, wherein generally a male actor will shove his penis so far down an actress's throat that she starts to gag. Particularly with this one, this is generally paired with like close-ups of the woman's face, grimacing. Maybe there's tears. She might have applied heavy non-waterproof makeup to sort of let that run down their face during the scene. So they're not even necessarily focusing on genitalia. They might be focusing on just the woman's reaction, grimacing in pain during a lot of this sort of abusive sex that's happening within these videos. We're seeing things like double penetration, where a woman is penetrated either in one or multiple orifices by multiple objects or by multiple men. We're seeing now ass to mouth is becoming more and more common within these videos, wherein someone, generally a woman, will be having anal sex with a partner, and he will take his penis out of her anal cavity and insert it in her mouth. You know, this is really just a visual act, right? Sort of unhygienic, representing this sort of submissive, degrading positions that we're seeing within mainstream porn, but that's becoming more and more normal. Again, women are overwhelmingly the targets of this violence within these videos. I'm not selecting from any niche genres. You can go to any one of the websites I mentioned, look on the main page of any of these sites, and you will see videos like this, screen grabs, that sorts of thing. These are commonly featured in mainstream pornography and then generally on popular websites. There is a market for this. And research sort of indicates to us that about 88% of mainstream freely available pornography contains some sort of abuse towards women. And in these videos, women are constructed as nothing more than objects for men to masturbate into. So, do these abusive behaviors that I'm talking about right now that are commonplace in porn, do they cause rape or abuse? No. I'd say that it's a bit of a stretch to correlate one video to one specific act of sexual abuse in many cases. However, again, it does normalize sexual violence towards women, and it makes sexual violence inviting and erotic. And it's normalized wherein millions of people have watched these videos telling other viewers that it's okay, right? Just vicarious of seeing how many likes, how many views. That's telling someone who's logging in and watching a horrifically violent video, well, if others have watched it, it must be okay. So, commonplace in pornography these days are these sort of abusive acts towards women. And out of these, we can sort of pull out some themes that we typically see in mainstream porn. First off, you know, all women want sex from all men. Generally in porn, women respond either positively to abuse or neutrally. It's viewed as enjoyed by women, irrespective of how painful, humiliating, harmful, or otherwise unhygienic the act is. Women are routinely dominated, dehumanized, and degraded. You know, aggression, according to these tropes, is what women want. That's how it's sort of constructed, and the viewer can sort of refrain from questioning why he's enjoying women being treated inhumanely because it's so normal, right? Women are responding positively. There's no question, right, in the viewer's mind. I just want to note here that the porn industry itself, they don't deny the abuses towards women in their videos or in the industry. In fact, some of industry vets can capitalize on the narratives of violence towards women to market certain videos or certain actresses. So, for example, famous actress Belladonna, she stated that she was tricked into performing a painful anal scene, yet this propelled her career into stardom. As the industry capitalized on her admission that she was tricked into filming the scene by distinguishing her as someone who was willing to do just about anything within these videos. So you can see that nobody's denying that there's violence towards women in mainstream porn. In fact, it can be marketed upon, and many people find it quite normal and enticing to provide this content. Remember, there is a market for this. This is why these videos exist. So I would be remiss to talk about mainstream porn without sort of singling out teen pornography in particular when we're having this conversation. So when I talk about teen pornography, note this is all legal, and it's often the #1 search term on many sites. No crime is actually being taken place. All the actors are 18 years old. But the problem a lot of researchers, and myself included, have is that it eroticizes children, because the actresses that are used in a lot of these videos, they're being framed or being viewed through a lens that sort of make them look a lot younger than they actually are. It celebrates and normalizes sexual desire for children, under the guise that the actors in the videos are, teens, although they're legal. A lot of these videos and websites that market teen pornography in particular may use childlike language and imagery to sort of pull the viewer in. In terms of imagery, we see a lot of the actresses with their hair in pigtails. They're told by directors to behave innocently, alter their voices, to sound much younger than they really are. Women might be referred to as quote-unquote teenies, as skinny, as petite. Again, they're dressed to look like children, maybe in a cheerleader's outfit, maybe in obvious childlike clothing. But even though, this is legal and all the actresses and actors are 18 years old, again, they're styled to appear much, much younger. In some of these teen porn videos, especially, there's a big age disparity between the the teen female actress and, let's say, a much older porn actor. You might see depictions of grooming within these videos. You might see normalization of incest, where if there's a big age differentiation between the female actress and the male actress, you might see in the title that the male actor is referred to as dad, stepdad, daddy's boss, a neighbor, a coach, a teacher. Inequitable and inherently coercive power dynamics are at play there with not only the language but the acts, but we're seeing this quite often. Another sort of key point to note here in teen pornography is that young girls in these videos, they're generally portrayed as seductresses. And why is that important? Well, that shifts culpability, right? So the men acting in these videos, they're being seduced, so to speak, or that's how it's being framed by these young girls, or they can sort of extinguish any culpability or any ill will they might feel because they're not the ones seducing the young girls. They view it as the young girls seducing them. Also, this sort of relieves men who are watching of responsibility because they're viewing these young teens as sort of culpable for the sex that's happening, right? Because they're being seduced, so to speak, by these teens in the videos. One particular video that I remember sort of seeing when I was doing some of this research is from what's called daughterdestruction.com. This was on a mainstream hub website where I saw this. Again, this is all legal, but there was definitely obviously themes of incest and some pretty gross imagery within, for lack of a better term. So in this video in particular, and this is not uncommon, the actress was dressed up to look much younger than she was. She was clutching a children's teddy bear throughout the scene, which again may not be uncommon for a lot of these videos that depict a big age differentiation or try to make the teen look a lot younger than she is. What I probably found most disturbing out of all of this was the room that they were filming in was purposely made to look like a child's bedroom, and the wallpaper had like a lining on it that had the ABCs. Many of you who have children probably know what I'm talking about, like the little border on the wallpaper was very childlike, and all of this is purposeful, right? It's creating or setting a scene that although the actresses are legal and so and everybody's sort of consenting to what's going on, it gives the appearance that that's not the case. So when we sort of look back at the slide here, this is why many researchers refer to some of these teen porn videos as pseudo-child pornography, because of how these young women are being portrayed. Again, this is all legal, and teen pornography is often the #1 search term on many sites. Again, no crime scene taking place, all the actors and actors are 18 years old, but they're certainly made to look a lot younger, which is particularly disturbing to those of us who are trying to prevent sexual violence. This is normalizing childhood sexual abuse. So that's not the worst of it, believe it or not. The porn industry has to keep up with some demand for more and more extreme content. So a lot of my research actually looks at rape-oriented pornography, particularly videos that show graphic rape scenes wherein actors or actresses are sort of performing sexual assault. Oftentimes when we see rape porn on some of these sites, the language will be sanitized, so it won't be called quote-unquote rape pornography. It might be called forced sex. There might be videos depicting victims sleeping or unconscious or otherwise hypnotized. This is becoming more and more common. Some research a colleague and I did using Google Trends data indicate that searches for rape pornography are actually been on the rise since 2006. So keep that in mind. Rape porn is completely legal. These are actors and actresses, again, being filmed for these scenes. But this is becoming more and more common because the industry has to keep up with the demand for more and more extreme content. In fact, I was watching a documentary on the porn industry in which they were filming a rape porn scene, which was particularly disturbing in and of itself. But one of the key things I took away with that was sort of the crux of the scene was this young actress was supposed to be being gang raped by 4 men in ski masks. And in this scene, the director can be heard telling the actress that she will get an extra $1,000 if she can successfully escape from the perpetrators. What does this tell you? This is telling you that the director is trying to make this look as authentic as humanly possible, right? They're encouraging this actress, fight back, get away from them, because they want this to look authentic for the viewer. On a lot of the rape porn websites or rape porn videos, we might see perpetrator characteristics not highlighted, and we generally see a focus on the victim. Well, why is that? Well, researchers have postulated that a viewer can imagine himself in the scene if we really just focus on the victim and sort of back away from perpetrator characteristics in a lot of these rape porn scenes. We're also seeing a lot more torture porn on some of these sites. This isn't to be confused with traditional BDSM practices, which generally highlight methodically mutuality and consent. Really, I think the porn industry, or particularly porn hub sites, have sort of co-opted that community and taken these snapshots of videos with no mention of consent, no mention of dialogue, and so viewers can sort of search out specific scenes just showing torture and degradation, right? And they may or may not be active within the BDSM community, but if they're seeking out these videos and finding them on hub sites, they're just seeing snapshots of sexual violence rather than any sort of conversation about consent or anything like that. Couple things to note here. In terms of the Stanford rape case that we're all very familiar with, after that case sort of hit the media, what's interesting is xhamster.com, which is another big mainstream porn website, which I can't tell you why they named it that, but it's xhamster.com, and they actually eliminated rape porn from their website after the Stanford case came out. That's both good and bad, right? I'm glad that they're eliminating that content, but I also see that as sort of commodified altruism, wherein, you know, there's a market for this content, and they may just divert it to other sites, or, you know, they might be trying to create a name for themselves by saying that, you know, I'm not going to host this content anymore, but I don't know how benevolent their actions were in that case. So At this point, you might be asking yourself, why does porn like this exist? Who is watching this? You know, there's a large market for this, and it grows daily, as does production. You know, a lot of people are seeking out not only this content that I'm talking about right now in terms of rape porn or torture porn, but all the other videos that highlight violence towards women. There is a market for it because it's more normalized now. So now that we've sort of talked about all of the content that I'm seeing within the porn industry based on research, let's talk about what many of you probably want to know is how is this impacting attitudes and behaviors? You're probably thinking to yourself like, well, okay, well, tell me how this is impacting people on the ground. So let's talk about that. So first off, let's talk about how this is impacting young people. Porn is becoming the de facto sex education for many young people. Absent comprehensive sex ed, porn is it. Porn is easily accessible for young people via smartphones, tablets, computers. People are being exposed at younger and younger ages. So boys are generally exposed to pornography around the ages of 11 or 12, girls a little bit later. Based on what I just told you about the porn industry, a lot of young people may be unwittingly accessing abusive content. They might be accessing some of this, you know, these violent videos depicting sexual violence, right? Especially if they're on mainstream sites. So they're unwittingly consuming violent content when they're very, very young. A thing to mention here is, too, absent comprehensive sex ed, I think that parents are also under-equipped to discuss pornography use in these contexts because it's a difficult conversation to have, and I think a lot of parents may not know the depth and breadth of the industry and how easy it is to access. So again, porn is becoming sort of sex ed for a lot of children and teens because they don't have any other conversation around this. In fact, when I do a lot of, when I have a lot of conversations with students on the college campuses, most times that will be the first time they ever discuss pornography in some sort of formal context. Sure, they've had conversations with friends, you know, within their social groups, but they're typically not having structured conversations about what the pornography industry looks like, how it could impact them, and how they should sort of view it through a critical lens, if view it at all. So this is why it's really important that we're having these conversations, right? Because this is not only impacting attitudes and behaviors of adults, but also impacts attitudes and behaviors of young people, as I'll note here, coming up with some pretty interesting data that some researchers have pulled around teens and their consumption patterns of pornography. Before I move on, though, I just want to note that not much surprises me anymore after doing this research, particularly now that I'm writing my dissertation on rape-oriented pornography and the comments that users post to said videos online. But sometimes I find myself being surprised when I'm having conversations with teens about pornography, about how much they know and some of the vile nature of the content that they've accessed, either out of natural curiosity or seeing it when they're with their peers or whatever the case may be. Sometimes even I am surprised by what teens have access to. So keep that in mind. This is impacting young people, and they probably know more than what you think they may in terms of the porn industry and the content they're in. So let's look at some research, shall we? This was some research done by Rothman and colleagues where they were talking to 16, 17, and 8-year-olds about pornography consumption. Generally, these teens admitted to watching porn at home, at school, and admitted to copying what they saw in porn videos within their own sexual encounters. So they've either viewed this sort of hardcore violent imagery either accidentally or purposefully. So this young man in particular, I pulled out this quote because this highlights some of the norms that we're seeing, right, with young people and who are watching porn. So this 17-year-old gentleman, he was inspired by the amateur pornography he viewed. He described a time when he used his smartphone to videotape himself having sex with his girlfriend without her consent. So this is an example of non-consensual pornography, otherwise known as what some people say is revenge porn. Non-consensual porn is sort of just a reproduction or sharing or creation of videos without the person depicted's consent. So he said here, we were together as partners, so she really couldn't tell me no. I mean, she could have, but I don't think she would have told me no. I was her boyfriend. If I wanted to make the video, ... right? So this is telling us that not only have teens that sort of internalized the messaging of pornography, but they're developing sort of coercive sexual behaviors as a result. And they're experimenting with their partners and either imitating what they've seen in porn or filming non-consensual pornography while doing so. Some more research in terms of teens. This 18-year-old woman, she was experimenting with her partner given the positions they were watching in pornography. And she said, you know, the position that they were in was kind of extreme. To her, it felt like rape. She couldn't move. She wasn't comfortable, right? This dialogue is very common. There was significant pressure from young women to engage in sex acts depicted in porn. And if we know that pornography is inherently showing violent content depicting violence towards women, that's where it becomes particularly terrifying, especially when it's coupled with coercive sexual behaviors. So this is commonplace, right? This is not uncommon for, especially within abusive relationships, for a partner to be pressured to either perform what they've seen in pornography, maybe videotape the actions they're in, but this is startlingly common for a lot of young people. So like I said, there's linkages to dating violence in young people. More frequent pornography use has been associated with adolescent dating violence. There's pressure to imitate pornography, even if it's violent or degrading. 50% of the victims surveyed in this study said they were asked and pressured to perform acts depicted in porn. Like I said, this is related to non-consensual pornography, if it's being filmed, or if there's videos or if there's pictures being taken without the individual consenting. This is, again, startlingly common within these types of relationships, and this was particularly a study that was looking at young people. I think that before I move forward here, you know, what those of us in the field often miss is that pornography plays a major role in young people's experiences of men's violence, either directly or indirectly. You know, the victims that you're working with may not come out and say that their partner, you know, forced them to watch a particular video and coerced them into engaging in the acts they're in. But that could certainly be something that's happening, right? And research here would indicate that it is, even if a victim never directly comes out and says that to you. Another couple of studies around young people, sexual experimentation within heterosexual relationships from 2014 were particularly interesting, as they directly highlighted that when young people were watching pornography and experimenting with the acts depicted therein, that a couple of themes sort of were teased out in the subject studied. There was a normalization of coercive tactics, wherein women, young women, repeatedly were asked to engage in particularly anal sex with their partner, and they reluctantly acquiesced to these demands. Even if they sort of said that it was painful or they didn't want to do it, or if they were, you know, not in any way willing to engage in these sorts of behaviors. So a couple quotes here. A young woman stated, you know, he begged and begged and said I was stupid for not wanting anal sex, right? A young man was interviewed. He said he can be very persuasive Like sometimes you just keep going until they get fed up and let you do it anyway. Again, this is all around anal sex experimentation with young people. And what's particularly startling with this research is that mutuality, consent, and women's pleasure was largely absent from young people's narratives. So let me just repeat that. Mutuality, consent, and women's pleasure was largely absent from these young people's narratives. So they're experimenting sexually. They're being coerced, pressured, forced into doing things, and they feel it's completely normal based off of the pornography they're watching and also cultural mores that are typical within a rape culture. So another thing here, women's pain and discomfort was normalized within these same studies. It was anal sex in these studies was to be enjoyed by men and endured by women. So a young woman was interviewed and she said, I just wasn't into it. He didn't seem to care. I wasn't getting aroused by it at all. It was just painful for me. So again, mutuality, consent, and women's pleasure was absent within these narratives, and women's pain and discomfort was normalized. So this was viewed as completely normal for young people to be pressured into, or be the pressurer into having anal sex, and to feel it's painful and feel coercion is completely normal. Another thing that came out of this study that young women were also viewed by their male partners as inherently flawed for not enjoying the experiences of anal sex, because most women in porn seem to enjoy it. So therefore, these female or these young women were viewed as somehow flawed for not feeling the same. So studies with young people, normalization of pain and discomfort, and a normalization of coercion, if not blatant force, specifically in these studies around anal sex. And these authors related that to sort of the rise of anal sex within pornography as of late. So let's talk about adults now in terms of changes in attitudes and behaviors post-consumption. So those studied, and this is pretty consistent across most studies. In fact, actually, I read a recent DOJ study that indicated that those who use pornography more so were more likely to be sexually aggressive in their real-life sexual encounters. We'll get into that more in a second here. But porn consumption has been associated with sexual scripts, normalizing hookup culture, which is impersonal sex and many partners. Porn consumption has consistently been associated with decreased bystander intervention and empathy for rape victims. So those who consume more porn were less likely to intervene in a situation where they saw sexual violence as a bystander, and they were less likely to have empathy for rape victims. Moreover, research has indicated that the belief in rape is not, or that porn consumption is associated with the belief that rape is not a serious offense, and accordingly, people who were interviewed were more likely to, in sort of experimental scenarios, give lenient sentences to those who committed sexual violence. A recent DOJ study indicated that those who consume more pornography were less likely to care about issues like human trafficking, likely because of all the negative viewpoints of women and children in porn, but they were less likely to care about that and view it as something warranting governmental intervention. As I said, bystander intervention is less likely within these scenarios, as is increased a desire to engage in or having acted in potentially violent sex practices. There's also an increased adherence to traditional gender roles and norms and antiquated views and hostile views towards women. Those who watch porn are also sort of very much adhering to beliefs in rape myths and adhere to victim-blaming sentiments. Moreover, I actually just read a meta-analysis of over 22 studies that linked sexual violence to pornography, and the author stated, accumulated data leaves little doubt that individuals who consume pornography more frequently are more likely to hold attitudes conducive to sexual aggression and engage in actual sexual aggression than individuals who do not consume pornography or who do so less frequently. Again, that was a meta-analysis of 22 studies over 7 countries, where this data consistently indicates that those who watch pornography are more likely to hold antiquated views towards women, to hold views conducive to sexual aggression, and actually engage in sexual aggression in their real lives. Lastly here, as many of you know, working in the field, porn is also used by perpetrators to engage in childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, and sex trafficking. In terms of childhood sexual abuse, pornography can be used to groom victims, to test boundaries, to normalize sex. In terms of domestic violence victims, they may report to you being forced to watch pornography or engage in sexual acts depicted. Trafficking victims are often shown porn to sort of groom them into the behaviors that they should be engaging in by sex traffickers, or that men or those who visit them are supposed to or would want. So this sort of runs the gamut in terms of contact abuse, and we're seeing this more and more as internet pornography becomes more prolific. But this is connected to tangible acts of real-world abuse, and many of you may have actually talked to victims who've had this happen. So, in the interest of time, because I want to leave some time for questions here, I want to talk a little bit about opening this conversation for you all to continue it. And I want to give you a bit of what I've learned through having these conversations, so you all can go out there and continue to sustain and navigate this rhetoric, because it's exceedingly important. So I don't know about you, again, I get bummed when the webinar doesn't address how to apply the information, so let's talk about how to apply this in your own work, particularly those who are doing education. So when we're having these conversations, they're pretty graphic, right? All the things I talked about are pretty horrific, and it can be difficult to have these conversations with those who aren't versed in the work. So it's important when you're having these conversations, even if it's with students or your constituents or whomever it might be, that you create a safe space for dialogue where people feel comfortable sharing. Like I said earlier, in my experience, this is the first time that many people have ever been given the space to formally discuss pornography in sort of an educative setting. So creating sort of a safety net for them to be able to have difficult conversations, to make difficult statements, is pretty important. Moreover, if you're working with students who may say something offensive, you're probably doing something right. And I say that because if you hear something offensive, you're probably creating a safe enough space where people feel comfortable to share. Let me give you an example of this. So I was in a fraternity house having this conversation about pornography and the impact on relationships. And towards the end of the presentation, a young man raised his hand when I asked if there were any other comments or questions. And he said that he thinks that porn has really turned him off from his girlfriend. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he said, well, I'm angry at her, and I'm really sanitizing the language that he used here, but he was angry and frustrated at her for not engaging in the acts that he saw in mainstream porn. That not only was she not engaging in the acts that he was seeing in porn, but that she didn't look like the porn stars that he was seeing online. And he harbored a lot of resentment towards her for that. Now, as a feminist, as a gender scholar, was I initially horrified by that content or that comment and continue to be? Sure, absolutely. But I tried to frame that positively in that I was able to create a safe enough space where he felt comfortable sharing that. And his comment didn't surprise me, but know that you know, it was sort of horrifying on the inside, and I had to sort of save face and put my advocate face on, so to speak, as many of you know, and act like it didn't bother me, because I was really happy that he was candid enough to, you know, share that in that space, because I think that if he was saying that, you know, a lot of young men sort of agree with that sentiment. So again, if you're having these conversations, particularly with students or really with anyone, if you feel, you know, that someone said something offensive, you know, or you're kind of horrified as your inner feminist is a bit, you know, horrified by what was said, you might be doing something right because you're creating a safe enough space here. I said this earlier, but be prepared to be surprised by how much young people know about pornography. I'm pretty well versed in this research, but sometimes even my hair blows back sometimes because I'm a little surprised by how much younger people know and what they've watched and what they've consumed and normalized within their lives, so be prepared for that. Another thing is your comfort level with this material is going to translate to how comfortable audience members feel sharing, conversing, and dialoguing. If you feel uncomfortable, if that's your audience is reading that, they may be less inclined to have the conversation or to speak up. So try your best, even though a lot of this stuff is particularly horrible and hard to talk about, to sort of create a space where you're comfortable and your audience is comfortable. Sort of harkening back to being surprised by what young people know, don't assume that everyone is on the same level. For lack of a better term, proficiency with porn. You may in the same presentation have one person who's surprising to you with their knowledge, and then another person on the other side of the room who knows nothing and has never visited a pornographic website in their life, and they don't know what you're talking about. So keep that in mind too, that you'll have a whole bunch of personalities in the room depending on what group you're talking to, and it's best to try to cater to that as much as possible. Also, use disclaimers. When you're having this conversation, much like I did with you all. Prepare your audience for what they're going to hear and see. They probably have never had this conversation before, so make sure to note that it's graphic, that you're not shaming them or pathologizing them, that you're going to try to keep it as sex positive as possible. You know, try to tell them what you're focusing on. You know, if you're focusing on mainstream porn marketed to heterosexual men, be mindful of that, right? Like, let them know that. Also, I always use this disclaimer. I'm surprised I actually didn't say that today. That was a brain fart on my part. But I say at the beginning of my presentations, especially with students, I say I can be critical of porn without being anti-sex. The same way I can be critical of McDonald's business practices without being anti-food. I think this is especially critical, these sorts of disclaimers, when you're working with groups of men. Because they may come into that conversation a bit defensive already, or you know, feeling like you may be telling them that they're horrible for watching the content, or whatever the case may be. They may be very defensive. So just letting them know that right out the gate can be super helpful in my experience. Another thing here, workshop your workshop to the audience. Adaptation is preferable to fidelity. So adding relevant content, being culturally confident, or excuse me, competent can be very important. So my presentations to fraternity men are going to look much different than those to sororities, or to groups of teens who are in high school, or to those of you who are listening in right now, right? Then make sure you're keeping that in mind. Accept embarrassment and be as open, honest, and authentic as you can be. I try to use humor as much as possible, especially with working with students. It can lighten the mood, it curbs this shaming sort of rhetoric, and it sort of eliminates the idea that you're preaching, because you know you want to eliminate any shame or judgment that may be inherent to this conversation. Some participants may even test your comfort level. They might say things that make you uncomfortable. Again, try to put advocate face on and, you know, just navigate this conversation the best of your ability, given the content. Lastly here, eliminate any shame. Be as sex positive as possible. You know, you're not there to stifle sexuality or to eliminate porn altogether. That's not realistic, right? You know, you're simply requesting whatever group you're talking to, whether it's students or fellow advocates or people in the community, to critically examine this content and ask them to sort of think about the impact in their own lives. So these are all best practices in my experience, and I've talked to students, professionals, teens, just it's run the gamut. But for you all, let's say you're in a rural area of Colorado and you're otherwise the only person from your office who can provide a training to whatever the group is. You can adapt that content accordingly. Like I said, adaptation is preferable to fidelity when you're having these conversations. The last thing to keep in mind here, are you going to completely alter someone's viewing habits based on the information you provide? Maybe, but it's not likely. So at best, when I'm doing these presentations, what I hope to achieve is to create a space where a dialogue can be had about these issues, because many people outside of our conversation will have had zero conversations about this issue. And even opening that up to let people explore the topic and to become critical of what they're watching, and even have a discussion about rape culture and how that sort of links to sexual violence in porn is obscenely important, especially for groups of people who don't get this messaging very often. So it is imperative for us who are working in the field, we have to sustain and begin these conversations with the groups of people we're working with. These conversations are difficult to have, and they're very uncomfortable sometimes. But I trust that all of you on this call are more than prepared to deal with uncomfortable conversations, and you probably have uncomfortable conversations every day. So even if you take this content with you and have a conversation with, let's say, your son or daughter, or a colleague that's not on this call, or a student in the future, know that you're really sort of opening the floodgates to have a broader conversation about not only pornography, but sexual violence and rape culture. You have a lot of ability within the work that you do to sort of have a really healthy, fruitful conversation about these issues. So if you want to learn more about this content, I totally encourage you to check out a couple of things here that I've posted on the screen. So Don John, if those of you haven't seen that movie, it has Scarlett Johansson in it. It's really, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as well. He's sort of the main character. It talks all about, sort of his relationship with pornography and how that impacts his real-world relationships. I've actually screened this with a group of fraternity men, and we had a conversation about pornography, sexual violence, and how it's impacting their relationships, and it was quite fruitful. So the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs sort of wrote this nice little guide for you if you do want to have this conversation and screen this movie to be able to start a dialogue. So I encourage you to go check that out. If nothing else, it gives you kind of a film for your own interest, so sort of examine how pornography impacts men. On Netflix, really great documentary called Hot Girls Wanted. Sort of talks about the porn industry, how women are sort of swept up into this, and how detrimental it can be in their lives. I highly recommend that. Pretty graphic, but a very good representation of what the modern porn industry sort of sweeps women into its clutches and then spits them out. The Media Education Foundation has a couple of videos. The Price of Pleasure, it's a little old now, that documentary, but still very good, highlights the porn industry and all the violence therein. And also Bro Code, if you haven't seen that, it talks a lot about masculinity and violence, and they touch on pornography within that film. As for books, I just got done reading, which I encourage all of you to read, Girls and Sex, Navigating the Complicated New Landscape. It talks about how young girls are sort of growing up saturated within a rape culture, and particularly a pornified popular culture, and how that's impacting them. Fascinating, easy read. She's a prolific writer. I highly encourage you to pick that up. The second one here, Asking for It, The Alarming Rise of Rape Culture and What We Can Do About It. I actually require that book when I teach violence towards women here on campus. Again, an easy read, very mainstream examples. Students tend to really like it, and it has a lot of information about rape culture and sexual violence. Probably one of the better books that I've found on delivering this information to young people, and super helpful for you as well. And then if you're particularly interested in reading up on porn, I highly encourage you to read Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality by Gail Deans. She talks a lot about the issues that I discussed today with a lot of depth and breadth. So I would highly recommend that as well. As I said earlier, these are some of the publications that I've written. If you shoot me an email after the conclusion of the presentation, I can get you access to these. The only one I can't give you right now is the top one. My co-author and I recently actually just got accepted our publication on online misogyny, in which we take sort of a broad look at how women are treated online and how that impacts women moving through that disembodied space. But all of those, I can get those to you if you need them. Just shoot me an email. And there's actually my contact information. I'm always available via email. If you have any questions that I can't answer here today, or you need a publication or whatever it is, please go. I highly encourage you to get a hold of me. You can also visit my website. Gives another list of my publications, and I can get you, that gives you a bit more information in my background and that kind of thing. So that's all I have for you right now. I am going to look now at the questions that you all have posted. Let's see here. Someone asked, does softcore pornography include the amateur pornography industry? It certainly could, but I think the amateur pornography industry is sort of swept up into sort of the mainstream content that we're seeing. A lot of amateur pornography has actually taken over some of the large production companies for pornography, as it's cheap to make, and a lot of private individuals or small startups can make that. So I think that would just sort of fall under that umbrella. Let's see. What is the best resource for educating teens about how violent and focused on promoting childhood sexual abuse and rape pornography is? I would say probably the best resource is you, and reading some of this information that I provided today and some of the research studies that I've cited. This conversation is admittedly difficult to have with teens, and I think that if you're just reaffirming that if they are watching pornography or they do view it, you know, that they need to be critical of what they're seeing, and they need to, you know, realize that that's not necessarily the way that sex is experienced in the real world, especially if they're watching or have seen pornography laden with violence towards women. So simply reaffirming that is probably one of the best things that you can do, and in addition to even having this conversation. Is there a documentary that I would recommend? Pornland and the Price of Pleasure seem outdated. Yes, Hot Girls Wanted, absolutely, very great documentary on the industry. Also, like Bro Code is another one that I would highly recommend, a bit more recent in nature. Someone asked, what is my self-care game like? Well, my cat has done a great job at helping me with that. And I've really taken the perspective, in all seriousness, of looking at this stuff clinically. As I said, I sort of am jaded to a lot of this content at this point, and not a lot surprises me. As many of you probably feel the same, right, in the work that you do. It can be difficult to navigate these conversations, but you know, like someone said, self-care is incredibly important, and that's where my cat comes in. And I'm also pretty big in the outdoors, so I try to do that as much as possible, because, as you all know, being saturated in the field of sexual violence can be overwhelming sometimes, particularly, you know, having these conversations and being met with any sort of resistance. So I try to engage in much self-care as possible. And then somebody asked, is there stats that show if a parent watches porn will their children watch, preferably a dad or daughter? I'm not sure about that, to be honest. Someone asked, do you think a convicted sex offender should be able to view pornography? This person said, I don't. You know, that's interesting. Some of the criminal justice system response around convicted sex offenders in the community have sort of dictated as a stipulation of their post-release supervision that they not watch pornography, right? I think there's a couple of different schools of thought on that. I think some may feel like that's sort of a broad blanket sort of restriction to have upon them. Others feel like yourself, you know, that this would be laden with merit, given that if they're already a convicted sex offender, they clearly have aggressed sexually, and if they're watching sexually aggressive content via porn, you know, that could be more detrimental for not only them but society. So I don't know where I fall on that particularly, but there are two different schools of thought. What does the resistance look like? I'm going to take that question to mean, like, how do we resist this sort of content? Well, when I'm asked this question, I say this. Having these conversations, and even though they're difficult, even though you'll have a lot of people who will argue with you, even though people may view porn as a harmless fantasy, just having these conversations and talking about how widespread violence towards women is in mainstream porn is exceedingly important. Like I said, these conversations are not being had as much as they should, especially with younger people. So just creating and sustaining a space where these conversations are had, where there is critical analysis being done on this content and how it's impacting young people and adults' behavior is incredibly important. And that's how I resist on a daily basis, is try to sustain and create a dialogue. Let's see, someone asked, I helped a female youth victim once that was part of a sex slavery group when her father was told not to watch her videos, but he did several times. Is this normal? Gosh, that's disturbing that he would watch those videos. I'm not sure how to respond to that. I don't know any research, you know, sort of talking about that sort of thing, but I can say, much like you probably feel, it's quite insidious to me that a father would watch a video depicting his own daughter being sexually brutalized. So I would say no, it's not normal, but I can't think off the top of my head of any research that would indicate to the contrary. Any other questions for me? Comments, concerns? You can always shoot me an email too. Like I said, just shoot me an email if you have any other questions or comments or feedback. I can get you any other research that I used here today. We can have a conversation about this. I'm always available to chat with you.
Well, thank you so much, Amber, for providing this presentation, and thank you all who attended. There was quite a few questions that came across while the presentation was going on about having access to the PowerPoints and the resources, and then if the video is being recorded and can be viewed later, and all of those are a yes. You all will receive a follow-up email with resources and a copy of the PDF PowerPoint, and then you can also find the recorded video on CCASA's YouTube channel. So thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Amber, once again for a wonderful presentation. Hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.